welcome back to part 2 of this 5-part series on the shadow being phenomenon. If you missed part 1, then I'll provide a link. It contains a little more info regarding this series, so I don't have to repeat all of that here. And with that being said,
Number 12.
This happened when I was maybe 10 or 11 and while I still lived in Idaho in the United States. It was sometime after my parents had gone to bed. I remember that I was supposed to be in sleep, but I was a stubborn child and would much rather sit upright on the bed in defiance than actually lay down and do what I was told. My room wasn't very dark as my door was wide open and the hall light was left on for me. At some point, I must have dozed off because I remember getting the strangest feeling that someone was watching me and it woke me up. I looked up at my doorway to see this tall, shadowy figure in a long black trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. I was shocked and still pretty young, so I stared back, but I was frozen in fear. Though it didn't do anything to me, it just stood there for a while and then turned and walked down the hall. I came back to my senses and scrambled to the front of the bed to see where it had gone, but it had vanished. I remember telling my mom the next day, but I didn't think much of it because I thought maybe it was a dream. A few years later, my mom told me that my cousins had started seeing the exact same thing. I thought, okay, this is weird, but maybe it was just a coincidence. I have always brushed this off as having an overactive imagination, but I got curious one day and decided to take my encounter to the internet. When I Googled his description, I found out that a lot of other people have experienced the same exact thing as I did. I even found pictures on Google Images of drawings people did that sent chills down my spine because they looked exactly like what I had seen. People refer to him as the Hat Man. If you're curious to find out more, they say he's one of the shadow people, but I'm still not so sure. I've been mostly a skeptic my whole life, and I've been really wary of telling the story because I don't want to sound crazy or anything. I am now 16, and this has been the only supernatural event that has ever happened to me in my life.
Number 11.
These experiences, which still continue to this day, intensified around the time I began dating my now wife. I would like to say that this particular encounter is somehow linked to a shared experience her and I had a couple months prior. However, for the sake of keeping it short, I will only detail my experience this night. At the time, my wife and stepdaughter lived in an apartment complex in a rather well-to-do part of town. This encounter occurred on a Saturday night a little over 4 years ago. After watching a movie together, I signaled to my wife that our daughter had fallen asleep on the couch. She whispered to me, so as not to wake her, that she would take her to her room. I took this opportunity to excuse myself to the bathroom, which was attached to the master bedroom. Once finished, I decided to lay down on the bed and wait for my wife to join me. It is pertinent to note that the foot of the bed was closest to the bathroom door, and that the headboard was backed up against a rather large window which faced the courtyard outside. The window of this particular room was intended into the architecture of the building. The light from the nearest lamppost outside, and all that it illuminated, tree branches, people walking by, reflected on the wall opposite of the foot of the bed. The window blinds were open, and the curtains were still drawn. Pulling my cell phone out to place on the nightstand, I recall the time being around 9:50 p.m., and gladly resigned myself to an early night with my significant other. It was not uncommon for people to walk their dogs or for them to be out and about at this time, so I thought nothing of it when I noticed the shadow of a child, which appeared young, maybe 8 to 10, reflecting on the wall, illuminated by the light from the lamp outside. The silhouette of the figure at first did not catch my attention. He appeared to be playing, running around, etc. Kids often played outside, and countless times I had observed families outside with young children, at odd times of the day in that courtyard. Nothing appeared to be amiss, except that the shadow lingered on that spot longer than usual. At this time, I also noticed something else. The shadow appeared to be on the opposite side of the blinds, meaning that the reflection of the figure's silhouette was inside the room and not outside of it, as the blinds did not divide the figure whatsoever. I froze. At this time, The figure's movements began to change, and I noticed that it walked from right to left, the width of the brick facade. It stopped once it got to the edge and began to walk, slowly and slightly hunched over, as if it were moving on its toes. I don't know what compelled me to turn around, but I did, and to my disbelief I saw it. It was just that, a silhouette that somehow appeared to be three-dimensional, but dark, black, with no noticeable features. It looked hooded, but I am unsure. Even with the full-on light flashing into it, it had no discernible features. I watched it move, this time from my left to my right as it began to disappear behind the facade of the wall, and it turned and faced in my direction. We stood there maybe 6 to 7 feet apart for a few seconds, staring at each other. I am not sure how to describe what happened next. Before I had a moment to even think, it moved more quickly than I have ever seen anything move. Think like the agents of the original Matrix film. And it was now face to face with me, the window being the only thing separating us. And just like that, it corrected its posture from its formerly hunched position and made its way back to the courtyard and disappeared behind the building's facade. I ran out of the room and into the living room, thinking that I would somehow intercept it at this point, but when I got there, there was nothing. This certainly was not my first or last encounter with shadow people, or the paranormal, and I feel that somehow something glitched the moment that I met my wife. When I told my wife about this encounter, once she was back in the room, she asked that we pray, and that we did. Unfortunately, I am still trying to understand what it all means.
Number 10.
A few months ago, my boyfriend came over to visit me at my mom's condo, so we slept up in the upstairs guest bedroom while she left to visit her own boyfriend for the night. I sometimes get anxiety at night, that people are going to break into the house or something. And I wasn't familiar with staying in this guest room, so I was a little on edge and I guess having trouble falling asleep while he slept next to me. For clarification, I was laying right next to the door, so the entrance was to the immediate right and he was to my left. All of a sudden, I distinctly saw someone walk right past me into the room and into the room's bathroom. It looked like a man wearing dark clothes with a hoodie covering his face, and he was maybe between 5 to 6 feet tall, but was crouching a little as he hurried past me. Nothing about his appearance at the time suggested that it was anything other than a person. This is one of my biggest fears, so I sat up a little and quietly grabbed my boyfriend with my left hand to wake him up and alert him to our danger. Since he was asleep, I felt like we were sitting ducks, assuming that this burglar had a weapon and was going to hurt us on his way out. So my boyfriend woke up and was kind of confused, and I was just scared stiff, staring towards the bathroom door. After a few seconds, when nothing happened, we just turned a nearby light on and cautiously examined the room, the bathroom, and closet. There was, of course, no one there, or hiding. I was totally relieved, but also very confused because I was so sure of what I had seen. The next morning, my boyfriend's watch was missing, which he had taken off the night before going to bed, and it's still missing to this day. Now, my only real explanation is that I was actually falling asleep and having some sort of hypnagogic hallucination. This could very well have been the case, except I wasn't convinced that that was it. I've had some sleep paralysis / hypnagogia experiences before, but never like this. I felt like I was perfectly lucid and free in movement as I watched this person walk right past me and felt the surge of panic and fear rise immediately. I've heard of shadow people and am wondering if this is an accurate description for what I saw. I'm not terribly troubled by this and actually just remembered it tonight, but the fact that my boyfriend's watch is missing is a little odd.
Number 9.
This took place about 10 years ago in Andover, Minnesota in January. I was riding with my mother in our Suburban, and I was 17 at the time. It was around 10 p.m. at night with little traffic. It was icy at the time, so we were traveling pretty slow, somewhere around 20 to 30 miles per hour. There is, or was, one light there on the corner of the intersection across from the lake. What we saw was this. Some sort of canine creature which passed only maybe 20 feet in front of us, which remained completely pitch black in the light of the street light and the headlights of the Suburban. Besides this oddity, the creature had legs, not including its body, taller than the hood of the SUV. It most definitely was not a deer or a moose, as both of us had of course seen those and were very familiar. The shape of it was all wrong. The extra oddity is it was big enough to cross the entire 4-lane road with a median in the center in about 4 leaps. It stopped briefly, standing directly underneath the light pole on the intersecting street, which is when both of us got our best look at it. Even directly under the light, it was nothing but a pure dark creature. I don't have an explanation for such a large creature in that area. I lived there 17 years, and neither me nor my mother have ever witnessed anything of that sort. It shocked us both to this day. I don't have a clue as to what it was, and to be honest, the thought of whatever it was makes me very uncomfortable, if for no other reason than the size of it.
Number 8.
This happened at an old apartment I was living in circa 2003 to 2005. Early on, beginning shortly after moving to this apartment, I would often feel like I was watched, and it was overall creepy, but I couldn't put my finger on the feeling. Initially, I checked the blinds, etc., to make sure no peeping Toms were looking into the apartment, and once I confirmed that all was clear, I just ignored the feelings as best as I could. I lived there with my husband, or boyfriend at the time, and 2 cats, whom we still have. The cats would sometimes stare at the ceiling, upper walls in certain spots, but easily dismissed that as them seeing some bug that I couldn't see, or hearing neighbors, or, hey, they're cats. Cats stare at weird things. But in hindsight, we have lived in 2 additional apartments since then, including our current one, which has active neighbors, and our cats do not stare at random spots in these apartments. Anyway, on the night in question, I went to bed at around 2 a.m., which was normal for me back then. My boyfriend always went to bed around 11 since he always had to get up early for work. My cats usually went to bed with me, but they did not on this night. After laying awake for a while, I decided to call to them to see what they were up to. I can easily see the short hallway dining area from the bedroom, and if the cats were running around like fools, I would have seen them as they raced through that space. These cats are a light buff orange tabby and mostly white calico, so they are easy to see in dim lights. So I sat up in bed and looked out in the hallway. When I did, I realized I was looking at this roughly 7-foot tall, deep, dark black mass with a rough head, shoulder, torso shape. The rest of it kind of trailed off. It was night and it was dark, but there was enough dim light in the apartment for me to easily see this thing. It was blacker than black, as if a black hole had somehow taken on a form and appeared in my apartment. Baffled, I leaned forward in bed and peered at it, trying to figure out what the fuck it was. I really didn't believe my eyes at first. I'm by nature a logical, rational person, so this just floored me. After I gawked at it for a few seconds, it seemed to turn. Even though it had no features, I just knew it was turning to look at me. And when it did, I saw it had red eyes. At that very second, I was overcome by intense fear and dread. I can tell you that I have been in some very scary situations in my life, but the fear I felt at that moment was more raw than any other I have felt. And right after it turned to look straight at me, it flew through the bedroom doorway at me towards my face. I did the only thing I could think of and ducked under the covers. Terrified only scratches the surface of how I felt then. After a few moments, I found it hard to breathe under there. I decided to elbow my sleeping boyfriend hard enough to wake him up. And by wake him up, I mean make him sit up, turn over, get annoyed, and ask me what I was doing. When he woke up and turned over, and I didn't feel him react in the way that implied that the thing was still in the bedroom, I felt like it was safe to pull the covers off of my head. Not wanting to seem like a crazy person, I told him I had a nightmare, and I tried to sleep. It did not come easily to me that night. I did eventually tell my boyfriend what I had seen that night after mulling over the experience in my head. I looked at it from every possible angle. Was I tired and hallucinating? Could I have mistaken a shadow for this? Had I been dreaming? Each suggestion was quickly explained away, and I was at a loss for words. Up until this point, I thought that ghosts were misty women in white dresses that haunted old mansions and castles. I certainly hadn't heard of or expected to see one in the form of a nightmarish shadow in a 70s era Chicago apartment building. I, and later my boyfriend, saw the deep black shadow again, but not as a 7-foot thing with red eyes. It was smaller and relatively non-threatening when we saw it again. I saw it once, and he saw it once on separate occasions. I can't tell you how relieved I was when I found out that my hardcore skeptic boyfriend saw the shadow himself.
Number 7.
In our townhouse, my sister, my cousin, and I would see these shadow people, seemingly children, peering around from the corners. They didn't seem malicious and seemed to want to be around us. It was to the point where we didn't actually fear them at all. We accepted their existence. They didn't show up only at night. They would appear on well-lit walls, darkly lit walls, and they would just be there, peering around the corner and then moving back to the wall as if they lived there. My sister claims they giggled, but I do not recall that. And the more rational adult in me wants to claim she made that up, being that we both heard, "What's up, Tris?" So it's weird disclaiming her claims. I've tried to contact them again. No actual method, just speaking out loud, knowing I'd freak out if I saw them. But I do honestly believe with all my heart that the shadows existed in my life at a time, and may possibly exist in that house or plot of land still.
Number 6.
I am a corrections officer or prison guard. I work 12-hour night shifts. One night, several weeks ago, I was sitting in the dorm's office station with the other CO posted in the dorm with me, and I was the acting sergeant. While watching the night vision cameras, I had them on a 2-on-1 cycle. I turned around to make a comment to the other CO when his face got real serious and he goes,
"Sarge, there is a man in the wing hallway."
I spin around and look and see a shadow standing in front of the classroom. So it cycles off and I bring it back to the screen, and now it's gone. So my officer nopes out, which means I have to go investigate. So I grab the keys, unlock the station door, and have him roll the door. I turn on my flashlight and slice the hall so no one can move behind me. I check the classroom. Nothing but air and opportunity. I call out for it to show itself the whole time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. Just an evil feeling. I cleared the wing in about 5 minutes and I radioed in that all was clear. Because of that incident, I still hate working in that dorm to this day, because I can't figure out what that was.
Number 5.
I'm married with 2 kids right now, but this incident happened right after my wife and I had our first daughter. We lived with my wife's parents until we could afford a place on our own, and the house was very old, like built back in the 50s kind of old. Anyway, a lot of weird things have happened to my wife's family in that house, but almost nothing paranormal has happened to me directly, except for this one instance. I was coming from the kitchen one night and into the hallway of the house, and in the hallway you can see directly into the room my wife and I were staying in. Through the doorway and on the other side of the room was my 1-year-old daughter's crib. As I look into the room while heading back to bed, horror runs down my spine as I see this black mass or a misty static shadow hovering directly over my daughter's crib. My paternal instincts kind of kick in and overcome my fear, and I rush into the room and probably did the stupidest thing you could do. I run full speed and try to physically strike at the black mass, which held the illusion of solidity. Of course, it melted away into the darkness of the room, but the feeling of dread disappeared afterwards. I didn't turn on the light even though I could have, and really couldn't sleep at all that night. I held my daughter close the whole night and let her sleep soundly on my chest, not wanting to let go. I was very scared, but very protective.
Number 4.
My mom and I were driving home late on Christmas Eve a few years ago. We were going past the airport, which is obviously particularly well lit. I wasn't driving and I was looking out the window. There was a streetlight, and as we passed it, I distinctly saw a human-shaped and sized shadow. At least, that was the shape my brain interpreted it as being, and it was directly underneath this streetlight for a moment. We drove on for about 30 seconds, and just as I was telling myself it was my imagination, my mom said,
Did you see that?
My guess is that maybe a big bird swooped under the lamp and cast the shadow as it passed. Although I didn't see a bird, it still creeps me out anyway.
Number 3.
When I was about 16, I lived in a different house. This house had its share of paranormal activity that I won't get into right now, but this one particular instance has always stuck out in my mind. It was late one night, and I went to the kitchen to get some water. Now, the layout of the kitchen is you enter, and to the right is a pantry with a door leading outside, and to the left is a small nook. There were no lights on in that area, but the moon was bright that night. I was waiting for my glass to fill. I was facing the pantry, but I had the sense that I was being watched. Although I would usually have that sensation, this time I had a sudden chill come over me, and I was compelled to look toward the nook, so I did. I turned my head and saw a figure standing in the dark. It was 6+ feet. I can best describe the shape as someone wearing a hooded cloak, but the light shining in from outside gave it more definition in terms of its body. Now, I hesitate to call it a shadow person because the descriptions I've read about shadow people has always been that they have glowing red eyes, but this had blue eyes, almost star-like. When I turned, I was startled, but so was it because its eyes widened as well, as if reacting to being spotted. After that, the figure's body mass began to collapse in on itself into the glowing eyes. In less than a second before, only the 2 glowing blue eyes remained and flying out the window. I have no idea what it was or what it could be, and I wonder if anyone has had a similar experience or could possibly shed some light on it. To follow up, I'm going to read the first comment in this subreddit. Oh my god, that happened to me when I was a child. I woke up one morning before school to a well over 6 foot tall shadow person with blue eyes. It saw me see it and just faded away before my eyes. The only difference I'm seeing here is that the eyes vanished on mine. I got an account just so I could post this, and that's how similar your encounter is to mine.
Number 2.
My boyfriend and I recently moved to a new town. My boyfriend had the luck to be able to transition into his new job very quickly. Not so much for me. There was a period of 2 or 3 weeks where I was just staying alone in our old apartment due to this. The first few nights alone were okay. I would surf Reddit, play video games, and drink myself silly until I passed out to sleep. One particular night, I was stone cold sober when I went to sleep. I remember being awake. I'm a light sleeper and not a toss and turn sleeper. So, if I have to reposition myself, I am always awake and aware of such things. It was early morning, between 2 to 3 a.m. I woke up feeling uncomfortable. Not a feeling in the room, more like I am particular about which side I sleep on, etc., etc. So I rolled over to the now empty space, which would have been occupied by my sleeping boyfriend if he were not already living in our new apartment, 3.5 hours away from me. His side of the bed in that apartment was closest to the closet. Just as I got comfortable, on my left side, a shadow person slowly eased itself from the closet, approaching me. It had no features, no hair, nothing standing out from its outline, slowly and curiously approaching from the opposite end of the closet, 5 feet away from me. At that time, it did not occur to me it was a legit shadow person. My first instinct was that it was a person and was about to do terrible things to me. I instantly rolled to the other side of the bed and jumped up, turned on the light and quickly grabbed my .40 cal that was on my usual side of the bed and prepared to defend myself from an intruder. Nothing. I searched the closet, under the bed, anywhere a person could have been, but there was nothing. I talked to my boyfriend shortly after the experience, and he told me he had also seen a shadowy figure in the closet when he was home alone, but wisely, he never shared that with me. After that incident, I would hear something rustling around in the bedroom while I was getting ready for work in the hallway, with the bedroom door closed. No fans were on in the room, no drafts, and my 2 cats were in the kitchen, probably knocking over cups and trying to eat stolen hair ties. Since I never got a negative vibe, or any vibes the whole time we lived there, I chalked it up that the shadow person had gotten attached to my boyfriend and I, and maybe was just being sad that we were leaving.
Number 1.
A couple of years ago, I was coming home a little later than usual, probably about 11 p.m. I live in a small neighborhood on the edge of town with a cornfield for a backyard. I've lived in this house with no problems or anything weirder than some packs of coyotes that travel through since 2000. Anyhow, I parked my truck in my driveway and just felt like something was kind of weird. I have a carport that is somewhat closed in, and it's about 20 feet from the house. It's always dark until I get to my front door. I got out of my truck and felt that weird feeling even more. I felt uncomfortable but continued down to my house because, like I said, I've never had any problems, just a few coyotes, so it's no big deal. Between my carport and my house, there is always a line of shadow from the side of my house and the trees in my backyard in front of the corn that extends to the carport. I walk by this shadow every day. This time, though, something was different. I just froze. Standing there looking into the darkness, I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. I had this feeling that something horrible was right there, just feet from me inside the shadow. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I was terrified, completely terrified. Everything was so silent. The kind of silence that is unnatural, you know? And then I heard it. This long intake of breath. It was like a smoker's wheeze that ended in this faint, almost screeching gasp. I slowly backed up and turned and ran inside my house. In a couple of days, I had forgotten all about it, until one night I had a dream that I was being chased by shadows. I had this dream constantly, terrifying dreams. During the time I was awake, I started seeing dark spots moving in the corners of my vision. When I would turn and look, they were gone. This really freaked me out to the point I went and saw my doc, who told me everything seemed fine. My girlfriend at the time was a nurse and begged me to get a CAT scan, especially since my father died of brain tumors. I almost did it until one night I was at the kitchen sink washing dishes when I noticed one of these dark spots go by the window above the sink. I shrugged it off, but then I realized the shadow was on the other side of the window. After that, I started hearing things outside. Not normal sounds, just some really fucked up things. Scratching, murmuring, breathing, etc. The thing that really fucked with me, the next week, a guy down the street from me who lived with his elderly mother ended up stabbing her to death. After that, I never felt or saw anything weird again. I'm not the type of guy who gets shaken easily, and I'm a skeptic when it comes to most anything, but I believe there was something unnatural going on. Hey guys, thanks again for listening as we continue our way deeper into the shadows. If you liked the video, then go ahead and show it with a thumbs up, comment, subscribe. You've heard this spiel before. And even if you're not the subscriber type, go ahead and stop back tomorrow as we continue this series with part 3. Until then,
Be aware and keep your eyes open.